going back to my grandparents, they found sailing to be a great pastime. And I can distinctly remember being out on the water and seeing so many different kinds of vessels and actually sitting there with a piece of paper sketching them. And that was probably sort of that seed that got planted and then grew into my declarations at the age of 14, sat around the dining room table going, I want to become a naval architect and I want to sail around the world. I've done the first thing and I'm finding a different route to doing the non-stop solo around the world.
My guest this week is Conrad Manning, who is a naval architect and design engineer. Conrad has a master's in ship science with naval architecture from the University of Southampton, and currently he is a naval architect with Kinetic, and he is a STEM ambassador under the name Conrad Manning Racing. Conrad, welcome to STEM with Mr. N.
Hi, great to meet you too.
It's great to have you on, and can we just start with, what is naval architecture?
So I usually try and describe naval architecture as something, well, if you look in the dictionary, it's quite simple. It's designing boats, but it hides the complexity of designing anything that goes on, in, or under the water. So it could be the aircraft carrier that's behind you, it could be a submarine, or it could be a fully carbon racing yacht that you see in the Solent.
And do you specialise in any certain type of ship with your architecture, or do you cover a broad range?
So at university, we did a very broad range of vessels and designs. So we looked at even hovercrafts and oil rigs. But with where I work at the moment, it's mainly focused around the military side of things. And where I worked previously, it was racing yachts and sort of carbon sailing boats and that sort of stuff. So it is very varied.
And I'd mentioned in the introduction there, I said that you're a naval architect and a design engineer. Do those two things go strictly hand in hand, or are they a bit separate?
Both. So when you're focusing on the actual design of a boat, you have to use naval architecture to design it. And the design engineer's role sort of comes around making sure that the thing doesn't fall to pieces, people can use it easily. And the naval architecture side sort of focuses on, does the boat stay upright? Does the boat go through the water quickly? Have you chosen the right propeller? So they both play together because one cannot go without the other, but they are separate roles.
And I mentioned obviously that you do both of these things, naval architecture and design engineer. Is that the case for most people that are involved in naval architecture? Or is it more often that you'll have your naval architect and they'll be working with a design engineer?
It depends on where they are in the industry. So I was at a small company and we did everything between sort of the five of us. So you were naval architect, you were design engineer, you were graphic designer, you were web developer. Whereas now where I'm at, because it's a much larger company, those roles are much more specialized. So we'll have someone who's focusing purely on propellers, someone who's focusing purely on hull geometry, someone focusing purely on stability. So it depends which part of the industry you're in and also how big the company is usually.
And when you're mentioning there about somebody focusing on propellers and somebody focusing on stability, are they then also naval architects and they're just specializing in a certain aspect?
Usually, yes. So when I was at university, we learned about stability, propeller design, hull geometry, and then going into the world of work, then people might decide to choose to specialize in a very, very niche area or looking at something a little bit broader, such as just general naval architecture.
And it's good to hear how varied that is. So it opens up different opportunities for you depending on where you're interested, I suppose, in the particular parts of the ship.
Yes, very much so.
And I'd also said that you are a STEM ambassador with Conrad Manning Racing. I see you've got your nice branding on your shirt there for this interview. So what do you do under the banner of Conrad Manning Racing?
So Conrad Manning Racing was created when I was about, in my mind, at the age of 14, and then sort of came together when I was looking to sail single-handed non-stop around the world as a teenager. And whilst I went and focused on my university degree, coming out, it gave me that opportunity to take up that professional sailing role. But when I finished a contract with an ocean racing team, I wanted to bring both the beauty and the interest, the fascination with offshore sailing, because it looks cool, and as means you can have a practical demonstration of engineering, which you can then take into schools, go to career days, create workshops, talk to teachers, and sort of led me to where I am now, which is sort of focusing on marine and maritime skills and career opportunities, taking from my wealth of offshore sailing, as well as my time driving a desk, to create that interesting and varied resources and support to teachers and the future employees of the industry.
And you'd mentioned there that you were sailing from, or Conrad Manning Racing started when, in your mind, you were about 14 and you were trying your solo sail around the world. But obviously you would have had to have been into sailing before then. So what got you interested in boats and sailing?
So I'm, well, third generation engineer. So I quite like this story because it sort of shows a different side of how I got to where I am. Because one grandfather was a lecturer in physics, the other in engineering. My father was a electrical engineer, my mother was a mechanical engineer. So when I turned up, it was, well, what sort of engineering do you fancy doing? Because it certainly wasn't humanities or English, because I really struggled with those subjects, being dyslexic. But alongside that, the whole going back to my grandparents, they found sailing to be a great pastime. And I can distinctly remember being out on the water and seeing so many different kinds of vessels and actually sitting there with a piece of paper sketching them. And that was probably sort of that seed that got planted and then grew into my declarations at the age of 14, sat around the dining room table going, I want to become a naval architect and I want to sail around the world. I've done the first thing and I'm finding a different route to doing the non-stop solo around the world.
And normally I would ask people where their interest in STEM came from, but you've obviously covered that there, having, all those people around you and your family who were all working in STEM. So I want to ask something slightly different there that came up in your answer. And you'd said about finding a couple of subjects difficult because you have dyslexia. How did that impact your education, and how did it impact trying to get into the world of engineering?
So I should probably mention that I didn't grow up in this country. I grew up out in Asia, and the different schools that I went to sort of meant that initially it was focused very much on my weaknesses. So that meant that it created a base level of appreciation, but also hatred of certain subjects. And then a different school that I went to focused very heavily on my strengths, so the maths, the physics, the physics at that stage, the problem solving, the geometry, that side of things. So whilst the dyslexia certainly was a challenge in schooling until I chose my A levels, it sort of then also gave me, I listened to a recent podcast and they called it a superpower. So my dyslexia superpower gave me that maths and problem solving and sort of, is it right brain thinking that helped me sort of succeed and enjoy what I do now. It certainly wasn't easy doing the English essays and the history homework and the geography, but they were a necessity to get to the A levels and to university.
And you're right, a lot of these things, are viewed negatively by people, particularly historically. When you and I were growing up, I've just aged you along with me. You look a bit younger than me, but I've had a hard life. But it was seen quite negatively, but now there is more of that looking at the superpower and where it gives you strengths, with that focus on the problem solving and things. And a lot of the engineers I've spoken to have said that problem solving is one of the key things that excites them about engineering. Is that the case with yourself as well?
Totally. I mean, yes, there's a lot of moments in my job now and at the previous place where there was points where it was quite mundane, quite process driven, and you go, well, step 1, 2, 3, let's just follow the step. But there were also and very regularly points where things don't quite go to plan, and you go have to sit back and go, actually, let's take this back to fundamentals, or let's find a different route forwards. And those moments are, for me, very exciting, because it's not just following the rule book. You have to think outside the box.
And how does that relate to sailing? Because as somebody who's not a sailor, I imagine though there's a lot of problem solving and having to think outside the box when you're doing things like racing, because things will happen, especially out in the open water, that you're not expecting. Is it? Am I right in thinking there's a parallel there between the two?
Totally. Spending 8 months sort of every hour I had on the water or working on the boat meant that both I could apply what I learned at university and sort of work out how to tweak the boat, but also did challenge things as things didn't always go to plan. Just purely having electronics and water, and we can all imagine how well that goes together. Engines, something about engines, and also the weather. No one can predict the weather. So when you planned your whole race based on one forecast, and then they realize, nah, that's wrong, but you have to then think quite quickly on your feet, because you realize everyone's disappearing off to the right and you've gone to the left, and you go, oh, okay, now where do we trust what we're doing, or do we make that change to follow everyone else?
Yeah, and there's the reason I was speaking about the sailing there and the parallels is because there's a lot of STEM skills that obviously come into the sailing, with having to understand how your technology works and understand the weather. So it's interesting that even when you're doing something that doesn't seem strictly like a STEM field, it has all these STEM skills involved in it.
I think that's one of the reasons why I quite like bringing that world of sailing into the ambassadorial, the careers, the workshops. It's because everything that I've come across, you can create a real world sort of exposure to that STEM subject, or that they're learning or would like to learn.
And I know something else that you advocate for through your ambassador work is getting more engineers into the industry, because I believe there's starting to become a lack of engineers in the industry. How is that actually affecting the industry in this country? Is it more that there's opportunities abroad, or is this a wider issue with a lack of engineers?
The simplest answer is it's a huge issue, absolutely ginormous. So a couple of years ago, the stat was we needed something like 5 apprentices and 3 or 4 graduates times the number that we currently have, just to maintain an even keel of the number of employees in the industry. And if you think that the average age of some industries, not just the one I'm in, their average age is 40, 50, some even nearly knocking on 60. So all of that knowledge is leaving the companies, leaving the industry. One of the areas we work quite closely with is the nuclear sector, and they currently are struggling to find the people who will come up with the next generation propulsion systems, or even just developing how to create the fuel. And if you think that if we don't do that, then all of our nuclear power submarines aren't going to be A powered, and B dismantled. But in the marine sector, I think I'd be right in saying, and it's not just our company, there isn't enough people, full stop, to fill the roles that we're looking for at the moment, let alone people who have the knowledge and experience that's needed to do the job that's being asked.
And obviously you came through the university route, which is quite common to a lot of the people I speak to in STEM. But one of the things that you mentioned there, though, is the opportunities for apprentices to get into the industry, because obviously university is not for everyone. Are there lots of apprenticeship opportunities out there for people within the naval engineering?
I'm trying to, funnily enough, I'm actually trying to create a pathways, and the local Institute of Technology is trying to create one as well, trying to plot that pathway that people can take into the industry. So university is certainly the most common, because then you focus on naval architecture as a course at Southampton, at Solent, at Newcastle, and at Strathclyde. I think there might be one or two more, but those are generally the main ones. And so, yeah, the universities are quite a common route forward because they're focused. But there are the creation of more degree apprenticeships. So we have a couple of where I work at the moment. And whilst apprenticeships, the pure apprenticeships, H&D, H&C, diploma, etc., they can create a route in, it would be slightly more indirect, but it would then give you that practical experience, which actually is super valuable, because rather than going, oh, in theory, this is how it should work, you can draw on your actual experience and say, I've done this before, or I've seen something similar. It's not going to work like that. We need to change X, Y, and Z.
And why do you think there is a lack of engineers, given the fact there are a couple of different routes in? What's creating this lack of engineers in the industry?
If you asked me probably 2 years ago, I would have been able to give you an easy answer because I thought I knew. But I don't know anymore, because is it down to there being fewer people coming through, fewer younger people? Is it how attractive the industry is? But that means that they're all going somewhere else. But where is that somewhere else? So I'm not sure, is my honest answer. Certainly there's more that we can do to change the perception of particularly marine and maritime. A lot of people still are either unaware of it, which is one of the big things that I noticed from the career days I go to, particularly with parents, or secondly, they think it's kind of mucky spending time under a car, etc., to coin a common phrase. So that's probably one of the two, but I couldn't pinpoint now exactly what the cause of that is.
Yeah, and awareness was one of the things that immediately came to my mind, because although I look at these things and obviously know there must be somebody that designs the ship and engineers it, I'd never actually come across the term naval architect until I met yourself, and became connected. So that's why it's great that you're able to come on and talk a bit about, you know, what you do and what's involved in that role.
It's quite a rare breed. To give you an idea of numbers, there were about 30 in our year at university, and if you say that there's 4 universities, that's not so many who go from university into the world of work.
Yeah, so I mean that's what I'm saying. It's great that you can come on and then talk about it and help raise that awareness. And hopefully, you know, through all the work you're doing with Conrad Manning Racing as well, and going around schools and career days and things, we can help, you know, increase the sort of visibility of people within the sector. And on that note of the visibility of people, you obviously had lots of people in your family who were involved in STEM. Did you have any particular STEM heroes as you were growing up?
I couldn't pinpoint specific people who inspired me or who are my heroes. Ellen MacArthur was certainly someone who inspired my love of offshore short-handed sailing, which then led down that pathway. But because my parents were both engineers, it then meant a lot of their friends had connections to the industry. There's probably an undercurrent of engineering that flowed everywhere, but I couldn't pinpoint a specific person.
Can I just ask about who was Ellen MacArthur? That's not a name that I'm familiar with.
So Ellen MacArthur was a very successful British offshore single-handed sailor. She raced in numerous different races, but really what sort of rose her to, well, the first thing that rose her to fame was the Vendée Globe, which is, if you think about Formula One, it's one of the 3 big races that happen in sailing. One is the America's Cup, which you might have heard of. The other is the ocean race, which is fully crewed around the world, and the last one is the Vendée, where you race 60-foot, fully carbon racing yacht, single-handed, without stopping around the world. She was one of the best placed Brits that's ever positioned in that race, coming second. She then went and tried to set what's called the Jules Verne Trophy, which is single-handed, without stopping, setting the fastest around the world. And she held that for some time. I think she still holds it as the fastest female non-stop solo around the world. But when I was younger, I actually managed to go on that boat and see the technology. She gave a talk about the experience that she had, and I think that was one of the seeds that got set of the sector, the industry, that the pursuit and the hobby.
And it's great there that it's actually, a female that's given that inspiration, because quite often in STEM, there's been that long-held perception that it's men that are in the field. And as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of STEM that's involved in sailing. So it's great that there's actually been a female role model there, or inspiration there for you, which has helped guide you in that direction. And obviously, you've got a lot of experience now as a sailor. Is that something that is a sort of necessary background for somebody moving into the field of naval architecture, or can you be a very successful naval architect and never have to actually sail?
Quite. I mean, a lot of naval architects sail, but on our course, I would put it on about 50% were sailors, would go sailing. But that's due to the fact that the industry is so broad. You don't necessarily need to be a sailor to design oil rigs, because they're almost completely different. So yeah, you don't need to be a sailor to look at naval architecture, or even be successful in naval architecture.
Yeah, and my final question for this interview then, because we've heard a lot about you and your background and what's involved in naval architecture. What advice would you give to children and young people that are interested in going into the sector? What's their best sort of way forward?
I think I might flip that on its head a bit, because very few people are even aware of it. And my number one piece of advice is to try different things. You might not enjoy it, but you might also find something that you've never even heard of that becomes the world's best thing to you. I certainly have found a number of times that, yeah, the thing that I didn't necessarily know about is fantastic, and I wouldn't change it for the world.
And that is a great note to end on. Conrad, thank you very much for giving up some time to be here. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. And to finish off, can you let people out there know, because obviously you do a lot of outreach with schools and things, can you let people out there know where they can find you online or on social media, and how to get in touch?
I'm quite easy to find, either through myself on LinkedIn, but also the Conrad Manning Racing on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, you name it. I'm hopefully going to be producing a lot more content around the next project, which is the development on the plastic milk carton paddleboard. It will be more of a kayak to go across the channel, so there'll be a lot of, well, as much noise as I can generate on that, so you'll hopefully see me through that. But feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to help where and how I can to inspire the next generation.